Hello, I'm LeVonder Brinkley, and my presentation is on Sensorimotor Psychotherapy for Attachment and Trauma. And throughout the presentation, I will use the initials SP for Sensorimotor Psychotherapy. I'm going to first give you an overview of what psychotherapy is, more of an introduction. Then I will tell you what I'm going to be talking about, just so that you have an expectation. Following that, you will learn about the creator, and the presentation will proceed from there. Sensorimotor psychotherapy, that's a lot to say, so I'm going to go ahead and start saying SP. SP is a little different from traditional talk therapies because we utilize the words of a person as the entry point for treatment. And this type of therapy depends more on bodily experiences of the individual as a gateway to awareness and improved mental health. Proponents of SP hold that traumatic experiences become trapped deep within the body. And with those who are affected, sometimes they are completely unaware of the existence of this trauma. And it's usually the unresolved trauma that gets trapped into the body. And when you're doing traditional talk therapy, it's pretty hard to unearth these unconscious issues. Therapists who are trained in SP techniques can help an individual to heal by helping that person to re-experience in a safe environment the physical sensations associated with the traumatic event. And this information was taken from goodtherapy.org if you'd like to source it. The presenter, or I should say the creator or developer of this type of therapy, a lady by the name of Pat Ogden, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing her right. She's one of the pioneers in the field of somatic psychology and the founder and education director of the Sensory Psychotherapy Institute in Brinkley, Colorado. And let me go ahead and give you an overview of what I'm going to be covering. I'm going to first talk about the causes and dysfunctions in the theory's view, central constructs for the theory, the nature of therapy for this model, the role of assessment, the role of the client, the role of the counselor, the goals of the therapy. Dr. Pat Ogden herself will do a video on an example of the technique. I will then move into the critique of the theory, how well supported this theory is empirically, the aspects of this theory that might need further research, how well this theory addresses faith and cultural dimensions, how compatible it is to the Christian worldview. I will make recommendations to make it more compatible with the Christian worldview. And I will also give you key resources and the references to learn this approach, and then we'll close with my conclusion. So at this time, I'm going to move on in the presentation with the slide showing Dr. Ogden, a picture of her and the Institute. So there are causes and dysfunctions according to the theory and diagnosis that are treated by SP. SP is done for people who have experienced trauma. And this trauma, it can be trauma and or attachment. And most of the time, or lots of times, trauma and attachment overlap. So if a person has a history of sexual, emotional, or physical trauma or neglect, this is an ideal trauma treatment for that. I'm going to use my mother's as an example. My mother was 5 years old when she lost her mother. Her mother was only 25 and died shortly after childbirth. And, that's a trauma. So that's an attachment trauma as well. So I had a dream once that my mother, who was a very depressed person, I dreamt that my mother had this little girl just step right out of her. And it was strange, and the little girl just came to me for love. And I woke up from that dream thinking, wow, there is really this little girl inside of my mother who's been traumatized, but was never treated or loved properly. And she'd gone to live with her grandmother, who was traumatized by the loss of her daughter and had 2 other younger children to die even before her 25-year-old daughter. So I descend from a history of persons with mother figures, for that matter, with trauma and attachment in problems, issues. Attachment issues, they manifest as somatic issues. And most therapies do not deal with issues and trauma that may be held inside the body. So, as I mentioned before, depression is treated. Really major depression or depression that have been unresponsive to other treatments really do well with this type of therapy. People who want to live authentically, they just have a desire to live more authentically, who want to be mindful of their body talk, who realize that their body can talk to them, and who have a desire to enhance self-awareness, or maybe they have addictions to alcohol or drugs or like me, food or sugar, carbohydrates. But these are all people who will benefit from SP because they learn to listen to their bodies. Some of the central constructs of this type of therapy are somatic narratives in nature, also procedural habits, because we've gotten stuck in our past and we are unconscious that we have created these procedural habits that we resort to. They may show up like, in our posture or certain grimaces or gestures that we make. They're just procedural habits because of trauma that we've experienced, and we're totally unaware. So another construct is to be able to increase nonverbal vocabulary, because we can't always talk about our trauma. And then again, we have these pieces of ourselves that have been separated or buried, that we have not been able to access. And so that is another central construct of this SP, because we learn to access inaccessible parts of ourselves. Another somatic narrative that is, or story that's been told, is language that is being told via the body. Because as my image says, words are not always enough. Sometimes we have to express in ways other than words. And we're able to increase our relational responses, our arousal levels, like our hypo or hyper arousal levels as fight, flight, or freeze, levels in relationships, when we are able to tell a somatic narrative via our body. And then we have the procedural memory. These are messages that are told through our posture, through gestures that we make, through the movements that we make, facial expressions, eye gaze. And usually we are totally unaware of these because they are habits that we've learned, procedures that have been committed to memory, and we have no idea, but we are doing it. Another somatic narrative is when we explore those internal working models. You look at my image, you see the two people with the little children inside. And that's probably where I should have talked about my mother and the little girl within. That little hurt girl, childhood attachment experiences, losing her mother, and then the trauma that came from losing her mother. When I had that dream, I knew nothing about this or psychotherapy for that matter, but that's a fact. When we've experienced trauma and attachment issues, there is that little child that's trapped inside of our bodies that we need to make contact with. Another useful intervention is that we learn through SP, we learn how to change our old habits. When I talked about those procedural memories, we also have procedural habits that are stuck. So this type of psychotherapy helps to interrupt those stuck procedural habits that we have. And then we have access to the self. That's a relational challenge that we have, where there are these fragmented parts of the self of trauma survivors. And I like to think of them as parts of our souls that become segmented from each other, and they remember. This type of therapy helps us to remember and bring those members of our soul and our psyche and our selves back together again. And this is, we often cannot access those pieces of ourselves through words alone, but we can do it through getting in contact with our body. Another relational challenge is the use of nonverbal vocabulary. Because oftentimes when we've experienced trauma or attachment issues, we have proximity issues, we're not always comfortable with being touched. But as we go through this therapy, we become more comfortable, we feel safe, and we learn to increase those that nonverbal vocabulary by being able to reach out and touch. And when we're able to touch, our relational abilities increase. So our nonverbal vocabulary is increasing through our relational abilities increasing, and consequently, we feel safe. Another relational challenge are those interventions for emotional safety. And I mentioned proximity is one, but then boundaries. There are some people, their boundaries are so tight that even parents or siblings or their spouse can't get close. And then there are other people who've been hurt and their boundaries are so loose, they're so huge that they let anybody in and they run the risk of being harmed and hurt more. They don't always know what to say or when to say it because their boundaries are just so lax. But with this type of therapy, with SP, you learn interventions for emotional safety and how to set appropriate proximities and set appropriate boundaries. Now we're going to talk about the nature of sensorimotor therapy. The body is your friend because your body knows what maybe your mind doesn't even know. There's a little poem that I picked up, You see in the image, it has water, nurturing water dropping off the finger into a beautiful little green tender plant. And it says, I said to my body softly, I want to be your friend. The body took a long breath and it replied, I've been waiting my whole life for this. Because there's some bodies like my body that have been abused, mistreated, and at times not loved. I've had body image most of my life, and I think lots of us little girls do. And I worked very hard on having my body to just learning to love my body and to connect with my body, to notice how I hold my head, or to understand why there are certain tensions, to become aware of my gait and how I walk. Your body is your friend, and your body is waiting for you to communicate with it. Dr. Ogden says, the body will always lead us home. We just have to listen. She says the body always leads us home if we can simply learn to trust sensation and stay with it long enough for it to reveal appropriate action, movement, insight, or feeling. And an example of this is with grief. If you are entering grief therapy, it's very important for you to feel the grief, to experience the grief in your body, in your mind, to cry, to do whatever, and to let that grief go and settle wherever it needs to go. The same thing happens with all trauma. Feel it in the body and let it do what it does. It will eventually lead you home. Or the focus of SP is on having a healthy spirit, a healthy body, and a healthy mind. The environment is also very important. It is important to note, and I'm reading from this poem that I have, I don't know if you can actually see it, to note that the patient's neuroception of the environment as safe or dangerous occurs implicitly. And what that means is that whether we are aware of it or not, whether we're talking about ourselves in a room like you are right now, inside your body, inside a relationship, or in therapy, in a relationship with your therapist, or with your client for that matter, you implicitly will feel whether that environment feels safe or if you feel danger. So with SP, the environment is very important.
So on slide 18? Okay.
Let's talk a little bit about assessment. During the very first session is when the assessment normally happens. And during this time, you're going to, most importantly, educate your client on psychoeducation. They need to know what sensorimotor psychoeducation is all about. So you want them to have an overview of psychoeducation. And through the assessment, you're basically guiding the client to understand what your client's abilities are, as well as to know the goals that your client wants to attain. You will also evaluate the beginning phase, because what's beautiful about SP is that you don't have to start at stage 1, 2, or 3. We're going to talk about stages in just a little bit. But as you're evaluating during the assessment, you want to see where you need to start therapy with your client. And when you've done these 3 things, you will then move to, with your client, creating the goals and the treatment plan. And you would do that with any traditional therapy. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the role of the counselor. And if you look at that picture, I'm sure you can see that is a different type of therapy. What therapy will you do where you actually have your hands on your client? But this person's hands are on the client's hands. The client's hand is touching the body. And this is what SP looks like. Because you're trying to help this person to access memories that are dealing with emotions as well as bodily patterns that the person may be totally unaware of. You also want them to be able to access mindfulness. You want them to be able to accept dual awareness, to discover limited beliefs, to increase their positive emotions, to look and examine neglected areas of their life that they may not even be aware of that have been neglected over a period of time. The therapist will also instruct the client in something called dual awareness. I was not familiar with this concept, but it addresses slivers or small pieces of information that are specific memories without them having to relive the past. Because oftentimes when the client has to tell the story again verbally and tell the whole story, he or she becomes re-traumatized. And so by a dual awareness, they don't have to tell the whole story, but they will remember little slivers or small pieces of memories. You will also help them to discover their limiting beliefs, because oftentimes people are unaware of those. You help them to increase their positive emotions and to access those neglected parts of their lives that they aren't even aware that were neglected. And then to achieve contentment and well-being is, which is one of the goals anyway of therapy. So now when we look at the role of the client, look at that slide. They're playing, and you can't even tell who's the therapist from who the counselee is. Counselee, who is it? Because that client has to have the capacity to play, has to have the ability to observe body tensions and to become aware of his or her posture and to develop new resources from within. And this is information, as I'm talking, I forgot to tell you where you will find information, but you will actually find this on the Sensorimotor Psychotherapy.org resources site. But it will practice empowering actions, has to have the ability to do that, to explore suppressed emotions. They can't be afraid of exploring those emotions that have been suppressed, because they can be intimidating and scary, but the client can't be afraid of that. The client must be willing to increase intimacy connections. Intimacy can be scary with attachment and trauma issues, but your client must be willing to do this. And to, as we mentioned before, explore boundary setting limits, and to explore new ways even of walking, because the way that you actually walk says a lot about how you're feeling. If you don't believe me, try standing up right now. Stand up normally as you would be unaware, and then stand up where you stand up straight, hold your shoulders back, lift your head up, and walk with confidence and step with a wide gait, and just with confidence, So you actually explore new ways of walking. This is somatic awareness, all a part of SP. The client has to be willing to do that. So now we're going to move into the goals of therapy, the therapeutic goals. And those goals are, some of those goals are going to be mindfulness techniques. Mindfulness teaches us to listen to our body. Mindfulness is spiritual. And most of us, as Christians, we know that we have to learn to be mindful, to get in the moment. To be silent, to be still, as Jesus commanded us to do, so that we can listen to our bodies and hear what our ears cannot hear. We have issues that we have buried, pains and hurts from, oftentimes when we're infants, things that we cannot remember. The isolation, left alone, you're crying, your parent says, no, this baby has to cry itself to sleep. You can't pick that child up. So what happens? The child has to become traumatized, or is traumatized, because it's been left alone. It doesn't know if you will come back to it. So what does it do? It cries itself to sleep. Sleeping becomes the first coping mechanism for trauma. And the trauma begins there, when we're not picked up, held, and loved, when we cry. So we have all of these spirit unconscious issues that have to be brought into a conscious awareness. We teach our clients how to deal with the negative impacts of trauma, how to alleviate all of that negative pain and emotions from trauma and attachment issues. So we're going to move into the techniques, and I'm going to try to go a little faster because I have 40 slides here to go through. There are 3 phases in this heart healing counseling. So in phase 1, to stabilize, you always have to stabilize your client. And in stabilizing, you reduce symptoms and you help them to develop their own internal resources. And the second phase is to address traumatic memories. And the last phase is to master those somatic integration, the somatic integration of body with mind and spirit. And this is why it's very important that during your evaluation that you listen to see which phase you want to begin with your client. And these phases can be used interchangeably. You may have to go from phase 3 back to phase 1, or leave phase 1 and go to 3. So you move from the phases as necessary. So next I want to see an example of what this not necessarily looks like, but just to hear an example, a case example. And this is with an adolescent child. I want you to meet Dr. Ogden. And in this video, this YouTube video, you will actually get to meet her. And so at this time, listen to her. It's very short, but listen to her talk about what it was like working with this adolescent child and how she helped this child significantly.
I worked with a young woman who was referred to me because she hadn't talked at school, and she was very, very withdrawn, and they'd had a suicide at her school, and they were really afraid that she would be the next suicide. She was only 13 years old. When she came to therapy with her mother, she held her head like this, really literally to one side, shoulders hunched, head held over. Her mother did all the talking. Her mother said that her daughter felt there was something wrong with her. The daughter didn't talk at all. As we started working, as a body therapist, I knew I'd wanted her to go from here to here. right? But first we had to explore this, and so I asked her about it, and she did talk, and she said that she wasn't confident. And as she went into this, she brought up memories of being bullied, like over and over, for being fat, which she wasn't, being Latina, being stupid, which she wasn't. And those impacts had a great impact on her. So she brought up one memory in particular of being 8 years old and reading something in front of her class, and everybody laughed at her. And so we had to work with that 8-year-old. It was very interesting, because it was almost like a child, a 13-year-old, working with an inner child, an 8-year-old. Yeah, and but we hadn't really addressed her posture, because first we needed to do that integration with that 8-year-old part, who was terrified to show herself and to sit up tall and bring her head on straight. And the 8-year-old really questioned if she deserved respect. She didn't think that she deserved any respect. So, we worked with that, and this girl was weeping. It was, it was really touching. And then after that, we started to address her posture and shifting the way her body held that limiting belief. But as soon as she straightened up, she felt really anxious. And that was that part that had gotten bullied, that was so frightened, So we worked with her, bringing her head up, and she had felt the anxiety in her stomach. And then she just brought her hands gently to her stomach to connect with that part and soothe it. And then she felt comfortable, shifting the pattern that held the belief. But we couldn't override that 8-year-old. That 8-year-old had to be included. The 8-year-old was terrified. So she had to keep track of that anxiety that belonged to that 8-year-old, and keep soothing it through the hands on the belly, keep protecting it that way as she practiced a new posture.
Did that have any impact on her life at school?
She felt more confident. One of the things she said that was really touching was that she said she felt like dressing up. She felt like wearing nice clothes to school, like the popular girl, she said, like skinny jeans. And she'd always worn, like clothes that just covered herself up. So that was a really good sign.
At this point, let's move into some of the critiques. So, as you can imagine, lots of therapists will not embrace this type of therapy, because this therapy is saying that the body is an agency, just like the psyche. And everybody can embrace that. This type of therapy says that clinical psychology should have a place for the body. It shouldn't just be about the mind or the brain. It should actually be about feelings in the body. And also, this has 3 areas of psychological theory which deal with body image, research around that, the cognitive science that most people, or you would have to embrace cognitive science, but body consciousness. And so a lot of people are not going to want to deal with the body consciousness. And I think body image research is pretty widely accepted. We know cognitive science is probably totally accepted, but body consciousness is a little different for some therapists. I'm going to move now into empirical evidence. And is this empirically proven? No. It's not empirically supported. But it is endorsed by leading international experts, and it is a neuroscientifically credible approach. So there has been research, but not enough research. Is research needed? Absolutely yes. Further research is needed. And one of the reasons that there has not been as much research with this type of therapy, as say with CBT, cognitive based therapy, is because of the lack of resources. Money has not been put out for SP like it has for other types of therapies, and that is an issue for why it is not evidence-based or empirically sound and needs further research. We're going to now talk about the really fun part, and that is faith. We are Christians at a Christian school, and faith is extremely important to us. Mindfulness, I would say, is the biggest faith piece, because mindfulness means being present with God, being in touch with your body, being in the moment. Mindfulness is synonymous with meditation, and meditation intensifies new life. Culturally, we have some issues there, because cultural values and biases are just implicit in everything. We live in a world that is, the values and biases are Caucasian biased and Western civilization biased. And it's a fact. And Dr. Ogden admits that's a fact. So what she's done is created online trainings where you learn about the Western perspective, the influence of racism, and so much more, so that the therapist is able to overcome cultural biases in that counselor-counselee relationship. And I'm grateful to her for that, and I can hardly wait to go through this training with her. And if you are going to use this type of therapy as a therapist, I implore you to please go through her training. So let's look at the Christian worldview. This is definitely a Christian worldview. It starts first, as we've said, with the self. And then we've looked at ourself within our body. We move into the relationship between counselor and the counselee. We also will look at relationships with the significant others, whether it's spouse, children, pastor, co-workers, parents, whomever. But relationships are part of this therapy, and that's what the Christian worldview is about. And then we deal with God, the relationship with God, and God's love, and of course, mindfulness and meditation. We also can help our clients if they're willing. We don't want to push our religion down their throats, but if they're willing to be able to tie in what they're learning and their growth with your Christian perspective, that's beautiful. Because they will begin to enhance their union, their oneness with Christ. And as a Christian counselor, you can share his beauty. I used the beautiful sunset with the cross because I wanted to share the beauty. And because they are becoming a new creature, help them to understand that this newness is in Christ. and to honor that newness in Christ. Also, help them to understand that we do live in a fallen world. In a fallen world, there are going to be times where we're going to have negative emotions like hurt and anger and sadness and unforgiveness. And there sometimes we'll even lose our faith and lose our way. But remind them that John 16:33 says that I have overcome the world. And that is Christ. He says to be of good cheer because I have overcome. And therefore they can surrender these negative emotions. Surrender them to God and find a peace. I feel that I went too long, but I wanted to be able to share. I have left off some of my references in doing this, but I have listed the references that I used. Please feel free to go to these sites. I did quite a bit with YouTube. There are lots of videos on SP on YouTube. And in conclusion, I concluded by saying that individuals who work with a skilled therapist often experience a multitude of benefits from this body-centered treatment approach. The Sensorimotor psychotherapy can help you a lot. It will be able to help your clients a lot. And before I forget, I'm going to go ahead and say this is coming from addictions.com blogs. You will see in the references that link. But individuals will learn to modulate their emotional and physiological arousal. They will be able to look at things not subjectively, but more clearly and more objectively. And the view is always better objectively as opposed to seeing things subjectively. They will become less reactive to stress and to challenges. They will be more proactive in all areas of their lives. They're going to have happier, more satisfying relationships. It will increase their self-awareness. They will become more mindful, which will help with their spirituality. They're going to have a greater awareness and understanding of the connection between their body and their mind and their spirit man. They're going to experience more inner peace. And who doesn't need that? And if they are getting it from a Christian perspective, they will understand it's the peace that only Christ Jesus can bring. They will be able to let go of those old, distorted beliefs. They will be able to handle life's challenges so much more effectively. Going to feel more centered, more grounded, and they will be able to alleviate chronic body pains and other somatic symptoms. They will learn to be more spontaneous, be able to make decisions more effectively and more efficiently. They will experience more joy in their life. And as Christians, joy is what we want. More joy so that tribulations are less. They will be able to make positive, conscious decisions rather than be controlled by an unconscious mind that's operating out of distorted belief systems. And they will be able to let go of past trauma once and for all and experience a spiritual healing in mind, body, and soul. Thank you.